The last chapter closed on a single mechanism: change the signal a regulator sends, and the behavior on the other side of the table changes with it. That argument was built almost entirely around markets, banks, and the private firms that serve them. This chapter moves the same argument into government itself. Public agencies face the same gap between paperwork and systems. Still, they face it under a different kind of pressure because the people depending on the outcome are not shareholders or customers. They are citizens, and there is often nowhere else for them to go. This chapter moves from governance on paper to resilience at the boundary. That single shift is the argument this chapter makes, and everything that follows works out what it actually requires of a public agency. Sit down with any public sector team long enough, and two stories emerge that do not quite line up. The formal story says everything is on track. Statutory deadlines are met, required reports are filed, and oversight bodies are satisfied. The living story surfaces in quieter conversations. Benefits portals crash during spikes in unemployment claims. Licensing systems freeze at quarter end. Payment systems go offline exactly when citizens need them most. The tension between these two stories is not about bad intent. Nearly everyone in a public agency genuinely cares about the mission they serve. The real issue is structural. Public governance has been built in a way that makes accountability easy to demonstrate on paper and fragile to sustain in practice. Traditional governance, risk, and compliance is not wrong on its face, and it reflects real accountability obligations every public agency carries. Statutes, regulations, and guidance documents each come with their own reporting expectations, and oversight bodies are right to ask whether procedures were actually followed. The strain comes from three burdens layered atop that structure, burdens that a purely procedural approach was never built to absorb. The first burden is multifaceted missions. A single agency may juggle preventing deaths, managing infrastructure, and regulating private providers, all at once, under the same organizational roof. No single procedural framework maps cleanly onto that breadth, which means the boundaries where citizens most depend on the system rarely appear clearly on any one compliance checklist. The second burden is fragmented horizons. Budgets run annually. Laws span decades. Leadership changes with elections. Citizens still need services every single day, on a timeline none of those cycles were ever built to track. Risk and resilience move at a pace that neither an annual budget review nor a decade-old statute can reliably keep up with. So problems that develop in weeks and resolve in months can go entirely unnoticed by the review structures meant to catch them. The third burden is dispersed accountability. When a public system fails, responsibility fractures across agencies, vendors, legislatures, and sometimes multiple levels of government at once. Strengthening procedural controls in that environment tends to add paperwork without improving the resilience of the underlying system. A statute can be assigned to every control that exists, a review can be scheduled for every identified risk, and the system can still fail at the exact boundary where a citizen actually interacts with it, because none of that paper burden was ever aimed at that specific point of failure. GRAA does not replace traditional governance, risk, and compliance. It shifts the focus of what that structure is actually asked to verify. A traditional GRC program is built to answer a narrow question. Were the required activities completed and documented? That question matters, but answering it well can still leave an agency with no real picture of whether the system those activities were meant to protect actually works when it counts. GRAA asks a different question underneath the first one. Instead of accounting for activities, GRAA asks whether an agency is governing outcomes, meaning it asks whether the promises made to citizens are actually being kept at the boundaries where citizens interact with the system, not merely documented as intentions somewhere upstream. That shift sounds subtle when stated this way, but it changes almost everything downstream, from what evidence is collected to what a leader is expected to explain when something goes wrong. Governance, resilience, assurance, and accountability are four capabilities that must work together for a public system to deliver on its mandate. None of the four functions well in isolation. Governance without resilience produces intentions that collapse the moment they are tested. Resilience without assurance produces a system that might be strong but cannot prove it. Assurance without accountability produces evidence that reaches no one able to act on it. GRAA embeds all four capabilities into the DVMS operating overlay to ask one direct question. The same question this entire chapter keeps returning to. Can the system actually deliver on the promise the government made to the public? Four rows make the contrast concrete, and each one reflects a real choice about where an agency puts its attention. Traditional governance treats intent as something expressed on paper, in charters and policy manuals that describe what the organization means to do. GRAA treats governance as intent operationalized at the actual service boundary, where a citizen and a system meet in real time. Traditional resilience is a continuity binder stored in a desk drawer, dusted off once a year for an audit. GRAA resilience is a measurable system behavior under extreme stress, visible the moment the load spikes rather than described in advance. Traditional assurance retrieves evidence from a file cabinet through self-attestation, an organization essentially vouching for itself. GRAA assurance samples evidence directly from the living system while it is running, evidence that the organization cannot simply write for itself after the fact. And traditional accountability means naming individuals to assign blame once a process has already failed, a search for a person rather than an explanation. GRAA accountability means answerability for the system boundaries themselves, paired with continuous learning rather than a search for who to blame. None of these four rows argues that the traditional column is useless. They argue that it is incomplete, and that GRAA fills in exactly the part traditional GRC leaves empty. Governance under GRAA is not a question of whether a policy exists. In public sector discussions, governance most often manifests as charters, delegations, approval structures, and policy manuals, and those artifacts genuinely matter. But the harder question is whether the intent behind that policy is actually operational at the exact point where citizens and services intersect, a key payment point in a social program, a settlement step in the financial infrastructure, the dispatch logic behind emergency services. Correct policies can be in place at every one of those points, and governance can still exist only in binders rather than in behavior, unless the people responsible for that boundary share a clear understanding of what must be protected, how it will be measured, and who holds the authority to make hard decisions under pressure. The method for closing that gap is the same question outcome and question metric structure that this book has used throughout. Citizens in crisis access payments within a defined window, even under peak load, is a question outcome stated specifically enough to link to a real metric. Once that link exists, governance stops being an aspiration sitting in a binder. It becomes a testable reality, and a public servant facing a hard decision at that boundary has something firmer to lean on than a procedural checklist. Resilience is not a recovery time objective written into a binder somewhere, dusted off during an annual review. It is visible in how the organization actually handles load, failure, and surprise as they occur, and it becomes measurable through four stages that a stress event moves through in sequence. Detect names the moment a surge is identified, ideally instantly rather than after citizens have already noticed. Contain describes isolating the impact to prevent a cascading failure from spreading into systems that were never actually under threat. Recover describes restoring full service processing once the surge has passed. Change describes modifying the underlying pattern before the next deployment, so the same surge does not cause the same damage the next time it arrives, which it eventually will. Because the consequences of public sector failure fall on citizens rather than shareholders, the standard of evidence for resilience has to be exceptionally high, not lower than the private sector simply because enforcement looks different or moves more slowly through a legislative process. Traditional audits ask whether processes were followed. GRAA adds a second question underneath that one, and it is the harder question to answer honestly. Can the organization demonstrate that the system actually behaves as required under real conditions, not merely on the day the audit happens to occur? The QOQM tree makes that demonstration traceable from the top down. A strategic objective such as timely benefits access branches into implementer questions covering throughput metrics and exception handling, and separately into auditor questions covering evidence that the system functioned correctly during peak load. Every branch of that tree draws its raw data from living operations, not from a file cabinet assembled after the fact. Drills reveal whether the pattern actually holds, and that detail transforms assurance from a compliance chore into a genuine operational feedback loop. A drill run once a year to satisfy an auditor produces a document. A drill run because the operations team genuinely needs to know whether the boundary will hold produces evidence, and the difference between those two outcomes is the entire difference GRAA is asking public agencies to make. In the public sector, accountability is frequently experienced as blame, which teaches people to protect themselves rather than surface problems early, since surfacing a problem often means volunteering to be the name attached to it. Defensive compliance responds to that pressure by scattering responsibility outward in every direction at once, so no single point can be held to account, and no single person carries more risk than necessary. Genuine accountability moves in a loop instead, with 3 deliberate steps. Identify the boundary that actually matters. Gather the evidence from that boundary rather than assuming it. Adapt and learn from what that evidence shows, then return to the boundary with that learning already applied rather than filed away. True accountability occurs when a boundary steward can name a specific load condition that degraded performance, point to the system evidence behind that claim, and describe the adaptation that followed, without fear of political optics shaping the story they tell. That does not eliminate political pressure, and public sector failures will always attract scrutiny. But it gives a leader a far more credible story to tell than simply insisting everything was done correctly on paper. The Internal Revenue Service lived this problem directly, and on a scale few agencies ever face. In the late 2000s, its paper systems described a mature, well-governed organization, while decades of accumulated technical debt had left the living system genuinely fragile underneath that description. That false confidence showed up in delayed refunds and cascading incidents, the exact kind of public failure no agency wants attached to its name, and the exact kind that reaches Congress and the national press almost immediately. The shift came through adopting ITIL, not as a paper certification exercise to add to a shelf alongside every other framework, but as a daily operating discipline applied at specific, measurable service boundaries. That distinction mattered more than the framework itself. The outcome was a change in what the organization was actually providing to the people who depended on it. Instead of producing reports about its own capability, the IRS began demonstrating day after day that its people knew how to operate, escalate, and recover at the exact boundaries where taxpayer trust was most at risk. That is the shift GRAA describes in miniature, a system moving from accounting for its own activities to actually governing its outcomes. Public institutions often serve 2 roles at once, and the overlap is easy to miss because they usually sit in different parts of the same organization. The same agency that operates a national payments platform also sets the standards private banks must meet to connect to it. A health regulator that runs its own IT infrastructure also oversees the systems of private hospitals and ensures it does not directly control. GRAA offers a single, unified language for both postures rather than 2 disconnected ones. When used as an operator, the DVMS overlay works exactly as it does elsewhere. Identify the key value stream boundaries, define QOQM structures at each boundary, assess which of the 7 capabilities are present and which are missing, and close the feedback loops that connect evidence to action. Acting as regulators, those same ideas guide oversight rather than operations. Rather than requesting only policy documents and control libraries from a regulated entity, the agency asks that entity to demonstrate feedback loop closure at a representative set of critical boundaries, the same demonstration the agency itself would need to produce internally. The core principle underneath this dual role is simple to state and easy to violate in practice. A regulator should not ask the private sector to do something it cannot demonstrate it can do internally. When the same QOQM language runs in both directions, operator and regulator alike, standards stay grounded in operational reality, instead of drifting into an arbitrary checklist that neither side actually lives by. Consider the relationship between a central bank and Meridian, the private settlement firm that this book has followed since its earliest chapters. When the authority requested evidence that Meridian's settlement boundary was holding under stress conditions, Meridian did not scramble to assemble a compliance pack for the occasion. It handed over a daily QOQM extract, the same structure that its own operations team already used every day to run the boundary. Current QM readings. Drift events from the prior quarter. Closure evidence for each one is already in place because the tracking work has been completed. The lead supervisor reviewing that extract had helped build an equivalent tree for her own agency's operational commitments, and she recognized the structure immediately, the way one practitioner recognizes another's tools. The conversation that followed was not a reading of compliance violations, item by item down a checklist. It was a substantive conversation about whether Meridian was managing the right boundary in the first place. This exchange becomes possible only when both sides speak the same operational language. Neither side is performing for the other. That quality of exchange requires the regulator to have done the work themselves first, which is precisely why the dual role matters as much as it does. GRAA and DVMS answer the same underlying question from two complementary angles, and neither one is complete without the other. Governance in GRAA is intended to be clearly expressed through DVMS structures, the outcomes and metrics that define whether an intention is actually being honored, rather than merely stated. Resilience in GRAA is the emergent quality of coherent DVMS capabilities holding together under real stress, not a property that can be declared in advance of that stress arriving. Assurance in GRAA is the empirical evidence that the living system actually generates. At the same time, it runs evidence that exists because the system produced it, not because someone was asked to write it. And accountability in GRAA is what happens when that evidence reaches an authority who is both willing and able to act on it, because evidence that reaches no one capable of acting accomplishes nothing. Take any one of those four capabilities away, and the loop stops closing, leaving the other three unable to compensate for the loss. Statutory compliance is non-negotiable, and no leader should expect otherwise or pretend the law is optional simply because a better operating model exists. Preparation for audits and hearings remains a legitimate obligation that will never disappear from public life. But leaders do not have to choose between preparing for hearings and actually running resilient systems, as though those were two competing uses of the same limited time and attention. Under GRAA, the evidence demonstrating genuine operational resilience is the same evidence that builds credible compliance. Preparing for the audit and running the system well will no longer be separate efforts pulling in different directions, competing for the same hours in the same week, because they were never actually two different things to begin with. They were always the same work, described by two different vocabularies that GRAA finally brings back together. The gap this chapter has been describing is not hypothetical. The Government Accountability Office has tracked it for nearly a decade, placing federal IT modernization on its high-risk list since 2015 and returning to the same finding year after year. The federal government spends more than $100 billion annually on information technology, and roughly 80% of that spending goes to operating and maintaining existing systems, many of them decades old, rather than to closing the gap between what those systems claim to do and what they actually deliver. In 2019, the GAO identified the 10 most critical legacy systems across federal agencies, the ones carrying the highest risk to missions covering healthcare, tax processing, and national security. 6 years later, in a follow-up review, only 3 of those 10 had actually been modernized. The paperwork describing a plan to fix each system existed. The living system underneath most of them had not yet caught up to that plan, and in at least one case, no plan existed at all. Researchers studying the public-facing side of this same gap have connected it directly to trust. When citizens struggle to access a service, or a portal fails at the exact moment they need it most, they do not experience that failure as a technical footnote. They experience it as evidence that the government is inefficient and indifferent to their needs, and that impression compounds every time it happens again. Governing this way, the GRAA way, is what it means to govern in the public interest, not to appear compliant. At the same time, the living system quietly drifts out of alignment with the paper that describes it, but building a system honest enough to show its own condition, and a leadership willing to act on what that system reveals before the gap becomes the next headline.